Whether you like China or not, Victor Gao begins with a chilling warning. You need to live in peace with China and get along with China. Why? Because, as Gao puts it, any kind of condescension or prejudice against China is not in your own interest. Let's stop for a moment. What happens when two world powers refuse to respect one another? History gives us clear examples. From the Cold War to modern era proxy conflicts, Gao is not just giving an opinion, he's issuing a strategic caution. He continues, what I do actually is to help you to have a better understanding of the realities in China. Gao shifts to history, 5,000 years of it. When we look at particular episodes, we view them in the context of our continuous, uninterrupted 5,000-year history, he says. That time span dwarfs the entire history of the United States. To the Chinese, America is powerful, but new. Gao adds, in that time frame, the United States is very important today, but that's not always that important in our time horizon. Why is this perspective crucial? Because it shapes how China reacts to pressure. Short term sanctions or diplomatic snubs don't shake a country that thinks in millennia. For China, survival and continuity are not measured in presidential terms or GDP. They are measured in dynasties, in the rise and fall of empires, and in the cycles of heaven's mandate. Consider the century of humiliation, a period of foreign invasions, colonial carve ups, and internal upheaval. England forced open China's ports with the Opium Wars. Western powers, followed by Japan, imposed unequal treaties that stripped China of its sovereignty and dignity. Yet, in its lowest moments, China did not collapse. It adapted, it remembered. Then came the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, which was not just a political event, it was, to many Chinese, the restoration of national dignity after over 100 years of humiliation. This long memory of pain, of perseverance, still defines how China sees the world today. Take the Silk Road, for example. Over 1,000 years ago, China was at the center of global trade and cultural exchange. Today, the Belt and Road Initiative is not just an infrastructure project, it's a historical echo, a revival of ancient patterns of influence and connectivity. What looks to the West like a new geopolitical strategy is, from China's view, a reconnection with its civilizational legacy. Even the Great Wall, often romanticized by tourists, is a physical symbol of this mindset. China builds to last. It planned for the next century, not just the next election cycle. This worldview explains why external pressures, sanctions, military posturing, media narratives are absorbed differently in Beijing than in Washington or Brussels. To a civilization that has survived Mongol invasions, colonial humiliation, and Maoist revolution, modern challenges feel transient. Gao's point is simple but profound. You cannot pressure China the way you pressure a young nation. You're not confronting a country, you're confronting a civilization. And civilizations don't panic, they wait, they calculate, and then they respond. Gao dives deep into China's darkest and most formative chapter, the century of humiliation. It began with a conflict the West barely remembers, but China will never forget: the Opium Wars. When the British engaged China for the Opium War, China lost that war. And that started the 100 years of downfall or decline of China, Gao says. It wasn't just war, it was degradation, dismemberment, and disgrace. In the early 1800s, China was the world's largest economy, self sufficient and confident. The Qing dynasty saw little need for Western goods and demanded silver in exchange for silk, porcelain, and tea. England, unable to sustain this trade imbalance, found a sinister solution: opium. Grown in India, smuggled into China, and sold by the ton. Opium crippled society and corrupted its institutions. When Chinese officials tried to stop the trade, most famously Commissioner Lin Zhengshu, who seized and destroyed opium, what is nowadays called Guangdong, the British responded with gunboats. China, technologically and militarily outmatched, lost. The Treaty of Nanjing followed. China was forced to hand over Hong Kong, open ports to foreign trade, and pay crushing reparations. But the humiliation did not stop there. The Second Opium War brought more invaders. This time, the French joined the British. In 1860, they marched into Beijing and burned down the old summer palace. After that came wave of foreign encroachment. Japan defeated China in 1895, snatching Taiwan and humiliating the Qing in the First Sino-Japanese War. Germany seized Shandong. Russia pushed into Manchuria. France took parts of the South. The United States, while promoting an open door policy, still profited from China's weakness. Foreigners lived in Chinese cities but answered to their own laws. Chinese police could not arrest them. Chinese courts could not try them. In their own land, Chinese citizens were treated as second class. China never wants to be bullied or colonized again, Gao says. I don't think any power in the world today will even indulge in the fantasy that they can conquer or bully China. This period is more than history. It's the foundation of modern Chinese identity. It explains China's fierce nationalism, its obsession with sovereignty, and its refusal to be dictated by outsiders. From its rapid militarization to its assertive diplomacy, the message is clear: never again. The century of humiliation may have ended on paper long ago, but in the Chinese mind it echoes still. It's not just remembered, it's relived in textbooks, in speeches, and in the very posture of the nation today. Gao points to a pivotal turning point in China's modern era, the year 2012. It marked not just a leadership transition, but in his view, the emergence of a force that would redefine China's path for decades to come. In 2012, China lucked out to have Mr. Xi Jinping becoming the top leader, Gao says. To Gao and many in the Chinese establishment, Xi Jinping was not merely a politician, he was a course corrector, a stabilizing force at the time when the country stood at a crossroads. The decades leading up to Xi Jinping's ascent was marked by impressive economic growth, but also by deep corruption, ideological drift, and growing inequality. China was booming, but confidence in the system was cracking. Foreign pressure, especially from the US, pivot to Asia was increasing. Internally, there was talk of peaceful evolution, the idea that Western liberal values might actually subvert the CCP from within. Xi ended that talk. His leadership was and still is defined by consolidation, a vision of power, of national purpose. Xi did not merely inherit the reins of power, he seized the narrative. He launched an aggressive anti corruption campaign that punished over 1 million officials, including powerful generals and senior party members. To Gao, this was not just about law and order, it was about restoring the party's moral authority and ensuring loyalty at every level. Critics abroad called it a political purge. Supporters inside China saw it as a long overdue cleansing. Xi Jinping came to power with a simple yet unwavering message: China will not kneel, not to the West, not to the United States, not to any foreign power. Sovereignty, security, and stability, these became non negotiable pillars of his administration. Whether it was standing firm on Taiwan, pushing back against US tariffs in the trade war, or asserting China's presence in the South China Sea, she presented a new face of Chinese leadership. As Gao puts it, he is a tough negotiator. He will not be swayed by international pressure. This is why Xi Jinping resonates deeply with many in China, not just because he makes life easy, but because he offers certainty in a chaotic world. While liberal democracies swing wildly between parties and policies every few years, China projects predictability. And in a country with a history marked by invasions, foreign humiliation, and internal collapse, predictability is priceless. His ideological banner, socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, is more than a slogan, it's a signal. China will modernize on its own terms. It will engage with the world, but not to be remade by it. And perhaps most symbolically in 2018, term limits for the presidency were abolished, paving the way for Xi Jinping to lead indefinitely. It was controversial abroad, especially in the West, but domestically it was necessary for continuity and strength. To Gao, this was not a step backward, it was confident. Xi's China, in his eyes, is not looking for domination, but is demanding respect. After a century of humiliation and decades of catching up, the time for apologizing is over. The country that once bowed is now standing tall. He brought stability, strength, and a clear vision. Gao says, to never kneel down to any foreign country, to preserve sovereignty at all costs. Here's where Victor Gao challenges. To understand China, Gao insists, you must let go of the idea that the so-called Western-style democracy is the only kind that matters. If China does not embrace democracy of its own kind, China would not have been able to achieve modernization. But Gao is not trying to imitate Western political vocabulary, he is redefining it. According to Gao, China practices a different kind of democracy, one rooted in meritocracy, long term planning, and public feedback, not in elections or opposition parties. In his view, democracy is not about casting a vote every 4 years. It's about whether the government delivers results, listens to its people, and maintains social stability. He points to China's rise from to the world's second largest economy as how did China lift over 800 million people out of poverty in just a few decades? How did it build the world's largest high-speed rail network, eradicate illiteracy in rural provinces? Argues this was only possible because of a system where centralized authority allows for decisive long-term action. In the so-called Western democracies, leadership changes constantly. Agendas get reversed. Progress stalls in deadlock. China, by contrast, can set a 30-year plan and actually follow through. He emphasizes another point, responsiveness. The CCP, he says, does not survive by force alone. It survives because it has built mechanisms like local consultations, grassroots surveys, digital feedback loops, and internal assessments to understand public needs and react. If the Chinese government ignores the people's voices, it would not last a single month. He often cites the Chinese term minju, which also and please excuse my lack of Chinese pronunciation, which also translates as democracy, but holds different cultural connotations. In China, Minju is associated more with the people's interests being prioritized, not necessarily with procedural voting. This model is controversial. Critics in the West, as usual, call it authoritarianism. They point to internet censorship, tight surveillance, and the lack of press freedom. But to Gao, those criticisms reflect cultural, judging China through a Western lens without understanding its historical context. China is a civilization that endured centuries of war, famine, foreign invasion, and internal collapse. For its leaders, stability is sacred. Chaos is vicious. And if a centralized system delivers peace, growth, and dignity, many Chinese don't indulge China by foreign don't judge China by foreign metrics. Judge it by whether it works for 1.4 billion more. In this argument lies one of Gao's core themes, that democracy is not a one size fits all product. It's not Coca Cola, it's a system that must grow from within a nation's own soil, shaped by its own history, fears, and hopes. And for China, that soil has produced my net that the West may not like, but can no longer afford. In closing, Gao laments something unexpected: China's poor storytelling. China is not very good at telling a story, he admits. Unlike Bollywood, it's a surprising vulnerability from a powerful ring. What if China's rise is not a threat, but a mirror? A mirror that forces the world to examine its own fears, its own history, and its own future.